Okay, I'm going to do a little video on how to FPP. This is my pattern. This is the tiny little star for my Ghost Party quilt, and I'm making 4 stars for a Jack Black right now, and there's also a bigger star. So these are my pieces cut out. You can see I've kind of laid them out how they're sewn together. And this is a mirror image. When I sew the black, which it doesn't really matter here because it's a star in a square, but it'll be mirrored image of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of my pieces and I'm going to sew. And I don't always follow the pattern numbers. I labeled mine how I do it, but sometimes the pattern numbers, the order of it doesn't make sense to me. Like this one does make sense because I labeled it how I would do it. But sometimes it would be like D1, D2, D3. So that means they want you to put a piece of fabric just over this first and then sew on D1 and then sew on D3. But to me, you want to use like out of these two, because this line here, this black line, shows me that one is definitely the third number, third fabric to go on. But out of these two, I would rather do the larger first and then sew on the little piece because it's going to be easier that way. Holding a little piece in place and then sewing on the larger is tricky, especially when it's on an angle. So what I do for something like this, we'll start with this piece. You're actually going to be putting your fabric on the back, but you're sewing on the front. So I'm going to hold this over, but I know that I want my fabric to be face up on this side, and you can kind of see the lines through. So if that's enough for you, then that's great. If it's not enough, you can do it. This is the fabric I'm using. So this is what I need to cut out. But so if I cut, like I like to cut my piece out pretty similar to the shape that it is, just by holding it over my fabric. And if I cut this out with my fabric facing up like that, my piece will be backwards. So I have to, and you can kind of trim this to actual size. I leave extra paper because I'm going to trim it anyway. But you can just crease it and then turn it over. So then I know that this is the right direction. So I just find the best place to line it up with my fabric. And I'm not going to cut through the paper because these are my fabric scissors. But I'm just going to cut it slightly larger than my piece, maybe 1/4 of an inch, sometimes bigger. So there's my piece. It's got a little wobble in there, so I've got to make sure I don't have that in like a little cut. But you can see that it covers. You can hold it up to a window to let light behind the back, and then that might help you see more. If like, I'll just fold that down because that's where I'll actually cut it out. You can see that it fits fully over that. And the trick with FPP is it's in reverse and it's backwards because you are sewing on this side, but you want your fabric to be facing out on the back side that has no lines. So it is a little bit of a mind bend, especially when you first start. Once you do it for a while, you'll figure it out. So then I have to cut this little piece here to sew on, and I'm just going to cut like a little rectangle that is much larger than is needed, but it gives me some leeway. So this is the purple I'm using. So I need to sew this line next, this black line here. And I sew all the way out into my seam allowance, but I only go to where this next seam that I'm going to sew the third piece on. I sew from that little where it meets, and then I go all the way out into my seam allowance. The trick is, though, that I have to put this on the back. So luckily my solid is non-directional and like non-back. There's like no back to it. I mean, technically there probably is. So I don't have to worry about that. But if I had a fabric that had a, If I had a fabric that was a print, I want my print to face my other print. And so I kind of lay it over. This is where having a light box or a window, if you're not used to this, helps. I can just do it by eyeball now, but I want to lay that over about 1/4 of an inch into where that fabric is going to fold, so that when I sew along here, it will be sewn, and then I'll open the fabric up so it right side is facing and that seam is like all finished off nicely. So I'm sewing it together, right sides together, and I'm holding my fabric 1/4 inch into the space that the fabric is going to fold over in. So I'm going to sew this real quick up, and then I'll come back and I'll show you what it is. Okay, so I went to my machine. When you're stitching FPP, I recommend a 1.2 to 1.8 stitch length, because you don't want to do back stitches because that gives you a thicker seam line and you don't want it to unravel. So I sewed from, I kind of visually had that line extend out, and so I sewed from the edge of my seam allowance all the way across the line, and I did end up going just past that line, which will not be an issue, but I didn't want, if that stitch happens to come undone, I didn't want it to be open. So there's that. There are a lot of products where you can fold your paper back. You can use a cutting mat, and you can actually, there's like add a 1/4 ruler, or you can put a ruler over this and give a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then actually trim it off with a rotary cutter. Because I try to lay my fabric as close to a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance when I'm placing that piece, I usually just clip it off like this. I'm pretty, I just kind of do that. I don't really worry about having an exact 1/4 inch. This one, I might trim it a little bit closer, because otherwise there's going to be just a lot of extra bulk in that seam because it's so little. Sorry. So I just cut it off a little bit. It's probably closer to like, it's more than 1/8, I think. But then what you're going to do after you have it trimmed is you're going to open that up, like, I don't know how else to say it, like fold the fabric into where the position it's supposed to go so that your seam is hidden inside. You can iron it now. Ironing tends to curl the fabric with the heat. So a roller is a great tool to have. I got this from Violet Craft years ago. And you just roll along that seam. It flattens it out, holds it in place, and you don't have to worry about the paper curling up. So the next piece that I'm going to do is this third piece. And you can see its background. It's the lighter orange where that's yellow. Hard to see on the video, but I know that it's background based on this too. So again, I know that I need a piece. I'm going to fold it along that seam there so I can kind of see. And I know I need it to just fit over that space. And again, I want it to face up this way. So I'm just going to kind of fold this over my fabric. This fabric is non-directional, so that makes it easy. Again, I like to have about 1/4 of an inch all the way around. I'm not cutting through that purple. I'm just going to go underneath of it. And I like to cut it as close to the shape that I'm sewing as possible, because that makes it easier to align. So there I have my piece. You can see. You could also cut this on this side and have your fabric backwards. So because we want our fabric, the right side to be facing up, if I put it on like this, and then you can actually see your lines to cut around. So this piece, I want it to be face up. I want it to end up here, but to get it there, I have to sew with right sides together. And so that's about where it's going to line up. So I do that first on this side, and then I'll turn it over and I'll fold this back, and I'll see like, oh, well, it's over quite a bit farther than 1/4 of an inch. So I could kind of even scoot it this way a tiny bit. So I scooted it a little bit closer where we're more at 1/4 inch. I want to make sure that this is the edge. It doesn't overlap there. Like, we don't want this, we want this fabric to completely cover the lined piece. And on the bottom, the same thing, where I'm folding it up where the line is, I can see that it overlaps there. So I'm kind of holding this in place. You can use pins if that makes you more comfortable. But you can see it is pretty much lined up in a mirror image of what it'll be when I open it, when I sew it. And then I'm going to go sew along this line. I'm going to extend this line all the way up through the seam allowances. And I'm going to sew along that line, not back stitching, and then I'll show you what's next. Okay, here we go. So I sewed all along that line, extending the line into the seam allowances. You can see I caught all my fabric. I always check before I do any trimming that I have a decent amount of fabric. Sometimes these pieces get slightly skewed. And then I also check, I open it up to where it's going to be. Because it did get a little bit skewed, I want to make sure when I kind of fold it over, you can see if I fold it up that it's going to fully cover that piece. So then I know that I can trim it. So I'm going to fold back the piece that I'm supposed to be covering. I'm folding this back this way and the piece back that way at the line. And then again, you can take a 1/4 inch ruler, line it up with this edge and trim off this exactly at a 1/4 inch. Or, because I'm a rebel, you can just kind of trim it off roughly a 1/4 inch, or slightly less if it's a tiny section. Then I'm going to fold that back over. The only thing I like to make sure of when I'm trimming, I mean, you definitely want about a 1/4 inch, but see this darker fabric? I want to make sure none of that peeks over the lighter fabric, because as I'm folding it, sometimes that darker fabric pulls through on the, I'm just going to cut off this tip, pulls through on the front side, because with FPP, you don't have really a choice of which way your seams go. So then I'm going to open this back up, and I'm going to do a little rolling, and then we have our piece, and I'm going to trim it down for you. So let me go grab my cutting stuff, and I'll show you how to trim it. It's magic. Typically, what I will do when I'm making a full FPP is I will do all of my sections, and then I'll trim them all down at once. But I'm going to trim this down now for you, and then we will go to, I'll finish these and show you how to assemble the whole block. So for this one, I am just making sure all my fabrics are flat, and then I lay it with my paper side up. Luckily, I have a ruler that's basically the same size, so I can trim it that way. But what you're going to do is you're going to line on your paper. This is your seam line for when you sew the whole block together. This is your seam allowance, and this is your cut line out here. So I'm going to line my 1/4 inch from the edge of my ruler on top of this line, and I'm going to cut along there. You can cut directly along that line as long as you printed at the actual size with no scaling. I tend to like to just align my 1/4 inch. Oh, here we go. I did not bring over my cutter, and I am going to cut just right along there and take off that edge. I'm going to cut along the top because my ruler is the same size as the finish, and along the bottom. This won't necessarily be easy to do on everything, but for these, it works out great. And then again, I'm going to go to the other side. And this is the only trick. My ruler doesn't quite reach all the way over there, but it should be fine because it just kind of goes along there. With a lot of FPP patterns, they have these kind of funny tips that are angled. That just helps you align things up better. I do cut along at least one of them. I just do it kind of because they're so little, just like that. And so then I have my full trimmed piece here. It's upside down. And then when I turn it over, there is my fully trimmed piece. So I'm going to sew up the rest of the pieces for the star, and then I'll show you how we sew all the pieces together to make your final star. Okay, I wanted to share a little trick. If you are making the star all one color, or on any FPP pattern, but it does show, and this is the bigger section of it, the little star is so hard to see. It does show 3 sections for the middle of the star. If you're making a star all one color, you can just make it one section, like just put a piece of fabric that's the same fabric over all of them. The trick with this is that you have to trim it, and it's hard to keep that fabric there. So my little tip is that I actually sew a stitch along the seam line, and then I trim all around, and I trim that last, and that will give you a perfectly trimmed single piece to take the place of those 3 pieces. I did it this way so that you could make it 3 pieces, so you have all the points a different fabric and the middle a different fabric. But you definitely don't have to do it that way. So I'm gonna trim up this these sections because I finished the other 3 sections of the star, and then I'm gonna show you how easy it is to assemble them. So again, remember that FPP is done in reverse and backwards, kind of. It's definitely done in a mirror image, and it is kind of backwards because you sew on the line side, but you put your fabric facing the right direction on the wrong side of the pattern piece. So it's a little bit confusing sometimes. So see, as I cut that last little line, it might hang on depending on where your seam is, but it easily pulls apart because I like to, as I'll show you, have my remove as much of the paper as I can before I sew the next line so that you're pulling out less papers. All right, so let me finish trimming these and then we'll go on. All right, I laid out the pattern pieces for a second little star, and you can see how this is how it was laid out at the beginning before I sewed, and now that I have sewed them up, they are in reverse of what they were there. So that's my piece that goes there. So now what we're going to do, and it shares this in the directions, and in any FPP pattern it's going to also share this where it's going to tell you what to sew together first. So mine is so section A to section B, and there's a diagram in the pattern. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, we have a diagram here that shows you the sections so that you know when you're sewing section A to section B, and it explains this over here, which sides you're sewing together. So you can follow that diagram. And that is with most FPP patterns, you're going to have an exact diagram like this. So I know I'm going to take my B piece and my A piece, and I'm going to have to sew those edges together. So to do that, I want to put them right sides together because remember, this is just backwards. If my pattern piece was there, it would be like that. So I want to sew those edges together. So I'm going to put it on like this. I'm going to align some of these angles. So I'm going to keep this pattern piece here until I get it aligned. Basically, you kind of want to align where this line comes up here and this line comes down. It does not align with that point, but that point is what you're going to align down here with the fabric. It's tricky. Sometimes I'm not sure why the programs put those where they put the points like where they are, but it tends to work out. So I'm going to line that point of fabric with the edge here. And how I'm going to sew this, because I took my paper off, you could leave your paper on and sew it like this with your little piece on top of your big piece, which is the easier way. You would again start out here, sew across the seam allowance, following that line, and sew back down. I like to have less paper to pull out of the seams after, so I'm going to remove that paper and I'm going to sew it on this side, just holding it right where I had it, and then sew along this seam here. So I'm going to go do that and then I'll show you. Okay, so I sewed that seam. You can see it's right along the black line, and I extend up through my seam allowances. I'm going to then push my fabric over the allowance, and it should line up pretty accurately. Like this should align with this, and this should align with this. If it's slightly off, not the worst thing, especially with this pattern. Sometimes it is a bad thing because when you align this with the next piece, you need it to line up absolutely perfectly. But on the star, I'm not really overly concerned about it because it's a star. Wonky stars are cute too. So then, based on my pattern, I'm going to take the section AB that I just sewed together. I need to sew it to C. So as you can see, I'm going to be sewing it together there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look and hold it over like this. I'm going to kind of line the ends here. But before I sew, because I don't really want to have to pull off papers on both sides, I have it in the spot. I'm just going to remove the paper. Usually you can just, the seam perforates it, so you can just pull it off easily. If it's taking a little bit more to get it off, you can just fold it back and forth and then perforate it, but you might want to shorten your stitch length if it's tricky to get it on and off. So again, I'm going to turn it to the side where I can see my seam, and I'm just going to follow that black line through the seam allowances as well. Okay, so there's my seam. It's along the seam allowance or seam line and through the allowance. You can see I took all the papers off before I sewed on this side, so then I can just fold it back and do my little press. And then my last piece to sew on is the final piece, piece D, and you can pretty easily see that it aligns up there. So again, I'm going to lay it over. I'm going to kind of align it and with those edges, and before I sew, I'm going to take out these papers so I can sew along this side and have fewer papers left. You do not have to do it this way, and probably in the beginning you don't want to take all the papers out until you're done. I just know that as you're sewing, your fabric is folding over and it gets trickier to get some of those papers out. If this is folded over and then sewn along that seam, you'll have papers under there. So I like to take out the papers, as much of the papers as I can, before I actually sew the seam. And then I have less to take out the end too, which is a bonus. So I'm going to, we'll do it right now. Hold that in place. You don't really have to hold this in place because we can realign it because we have the papers on the front. I'm just going to perforate, and you really only need to take out the papers now that you would catch in that seam you're going to sew next. So I could probably even just stop here, but because I'm already doing it, I'm just going to kind of lift those up. On these smaller seams, I tend to kind of hold my finger, like that big one I just took off. This isn't it, this is it. I hold my finger along that small seam because even though I did a small stitch length, I still worry about my stitches pulling out. So you can see this side has no seams or no papers left in it. And I'm going to align it with this that has the paper. If you have a really accurate sewing machine as well, that the 1/4 inch is very accurate with what this 1/4 inch is, you could just take all the papers off and sew it together that way. I do find the papers give a little bit of stability though. So I'm going to sew along that black line and then I'll be back. Okay, I sewed all across, including through the seam allowance. I have no papers on this side. And so I'm going to open it up real quick just to make sure that it aligns pretty good. If it's a slightly off, it doesn't really concern me. See, this side is not exactly perfect. You can trim it to the black size in the pattern. Because this is my final product. If I was making maybe like my bulldog pattern, I'd probably want it to align very well. But it's not. There is a little bit of give and take in an FPP pattern as long as you have enough to catch the seam allowance still. So this is another seam flattening spot, although good time to finish taking out the papers. The only time I keep papers in is if I'm not sewing the final product together very soon, and the papers help give it a little bit of stability and keep it from fraying, in my opinion. So I might keep those papers in if, say, I wasn't going to sew this up for like months and months. So there's the little star. The nice thing about this star being in a square and my star pack that I'm going to work on getting out in November being in squares is that you can kind of turn it any direction and you can have the star go in kind of a different layout. So that's kind of fun. And then if you want to, which it's always good to check, and sometimes depending on how big your seam allowance is, it doesn't always end up being exactly the size that it's supposed to be, but you can just trim it down a little bit. And of course, like I said, I am not a perfect sewer at all, so like this I can see angles down a little bit, so when I'm aligning it with my square next to it, I will just make sure that I align them accurately instead of making sure that this perfectly aligns with the next square edge. I'll have that square and there'll be a little bit of give there, but you know, it doesn't bother me and I can do that. If it bothers you, something you could do is you could trim the sides of the blocks that are sewn together, and you could leave some extra fabric on the outsides of these blocks that are the outside of the square when it's finished. So for instance, if I had these sewn up, I would trim this edge, I would trim all around there, I would trim those 3 edges and this edge, and then I would sew them together in the proper order, and then I could take my square and cut it down exactly to the size I need, because I'd have a little extra around the edge. So you could do that too. That might be a little advanced if this is your first FPP project, but here I have a finished star, and I hope that gave you a little bit better idea of how FPP works. I'm not the best at explaining and teaching, in my opinion, but I hope that I can give people a little bit of help that way. So this is the big star I'm going to do next, and there's a little bit easier star. I probably should have started with that for you guys because you can just see it a little bit better, but it basically is done the exact same way. It is sewn up the exact same way. You can see it's just a little bit like a mirror image of the little star, where like it's basically the same, just because of the size. These pieces like end up being a tiny bit different. These are different size. This is the same basically as that, and the same as that. Just it all is constructed the same way. It's just not exactly the same, just in a larger scale. So I will show you, I'll make these pieces and then I'll show you what that's going to look like as well when I sew it up, just to have another look at it. Okay, I sewed up a big star real quick, and I wanted to talk a slight bit about directional fabric. It is not always simple to cut an FPP pattern as directional fabric, but if you have a directional fabric like this plaid or this one, and you have pieces that could be directional easily, what I do for this is I would just lay it on my fabric, and I would cut around about 1/4 of an inch, and then I would just shift it over slightly to get 1/4 of an inch on this piece, and then cut around that piece and laid right next to each other, so they get a very close directional vibe. There might be a little bit of skew, and like with the plaid you can definitely tell, but at least both of my big plaids, they're all going in the same direction. So it's very hard to do that if your pattern is a really odd shape and you like have to align it oddly. It might not easily be able to have the fabric all be directional, but I do love to see patterns that people have FPP, that they've taken the care to have the fabric be directional when it is an easy process for some fabric. So again, I sewed up the large star, and I'm just trimming it down, aligning my 1/4 inch with the seam line, so my edge is along the cut line, and I'm cutting those large pieces out. I did my middle piece again as one large section instead of actually piecing it, and I will cut that side last so that it will stay on, and a little bit, and then see, it's kind of easy just to pull it apart. I just kind of keep them together, and then I am going to, actually, let's do what I mentioned. Let's try with the 2 outer pieces and just cut these pieces where we're going to align in case we need to trim it down. So like I had said before, if you want to keep the outer edges untrimmed, so that if you need to add a tiny bit of fabric when you're trimming it down after it's all sewn together like this. So I haven't actually tried this before. I've done it on other ones, but I haven't done it on this, so let's try that. Okay, so I've got the top and the bottom and these two pieces, which you can see, pardon me, actually I think it goes on like this. There we go, like that. So if I flip them over, I just did them that way first since I didn't trim these fully down. It's just a mirror image. So that's how I'm going to sew it together. So I'm going to sew these two together first. And again, I'm going to get rid of that paper and then I'm just going to align it. Just visually, basically, this little indentation aligns with the fabric and making sure that that does align with when I pull the seam across the seam allowance, that it will line up right about there. Okay, I'm going to roll that out. Next, this gets sewn to this side, and I'm going to take these papers out. Just making sure, double checking that it's correct. This one aligns actually pretty perfectly there. I'll sew that. Sewn along the seam, I am going to open it up, make sure it all aligns well. Then I have this last one to pop in there. So this one is a little bit different because I didn't trim the edges. So what you could do is kind of trim the edges. Also, you kind of want it to align. You can just kind of, you could use a pin. So you could put this pin through the corner and then go to the side, and you want this pin to come out right at that same corner on the other end. That's just about right. And then just make sure it aligns up right there, and you can kind of shift it together and then sew it that way. That's a good way to do it. So what I'm going to do, since I have that pin in the paper, I'm going to start on this side, and once I start getting it sewn, I can take off those papers as I'm sewing. Okay, you can see that I went slightly past the actual marks. I didn't actually take off this paper. Not that big of a deal for this one. There just ends up being more seams, and so there's just more little papers to pull out in different sections than if you do it before you sew. So I'm taking out those papers now, last one, and opening it up. Doing my little thing here. And then what you can do, since you still have that paper in the back, is just line up your measuring cube with it and cut out around so you get a perfect square. And you don't have to worry about it being slightly off. So see, my back one is perfect. This one is slightly off in some spots. So when I'm aligning these next to each other, let's find, I think this edge is straight here, and then it angles in slightly there. So if I'm aligning that with a straight edge, I'm going to take the straight part and make sure that's aligned, and then I'm just going to kind of align the rest of it and have that angle in a little bit, and I'll follow the straight line of the back one. It's very close to perfect, so you probably wouldn't even really tell if it wasn't aligned perfectly straight like this, if you just, actually I think it, oh no, if you just kind of sewed following the line because it's so close on that one, but that's what I would do. All right, so that's a great look at FPP. I hope it's probably still a little bit confusing just because if you've never done it before, but I hope it kind of gives you some insight and I was able to give you a tip or a trick to help you. Yeah, have fun making your stars.